Okay, welcome to the first digital history seminar of 2017 to 18 series. I'm not going to spend too long introducing, but our speaker today is one of the stalwarts at the seminar, one of the conveners at the seminar, and indeed a stalwart of the IHR, having been British History Online project officer for a long time. And today's going to be talking about a topic which is very pertinent at the moment, tying into a lot of debates which are being had in academic departments up and down the country, I think. So, Adam, please tell us about the history of digital history teaching.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much, Justin, and hello to everyone, and thank you very much for coming. I am going to go through what I think is a history of digital history teaching and learning. And I think in the past several decades in particular, we've had colleagues around the world who've been doing some really amazing stuff in the classroom. And what I'd like to do is to kind of celebrate some of that using the putting of technology into the service of history, some of the innovations, some of the achievements people have done, highlight the diversity as well of what people have been working on. I'm going to focus primarily on an Anglo narrative here, so if anybody's got a different perspective, I'd really love to hear about that afterwards. So that's kind of my disclaimer, that this is going to be very Anglo, and that's partly down to my own utter failings as a multilingual person. But here we go. So I think also, as well as celebrating, I think there's a great opportunity here to think about how we can do better for creating these resources and providing opportunities for students and learners in this pedagogical space. So you can think of what I'm trying to do today as holding up a mirror to digital history people more generally, so that we can kind of get a look at ourselves and see what we've done, and then maybe use that as a way to think about where we want to go. This is working, is it? Okay, cool. Well, thankfully we've got lots of traces of how this has worked over the years. Hello, good morning. And there's a lot of, for example, there's online email and discussion-based logs. So some of you will be familiar with Humanist Discussion List, which has been running since the 1980s. It's been a virtual meeting place for people concerned with computing and the humanities in particular. And it's a really great source in terms of thinking about the types of concerns people had over the years. There's some great recaps of events that happened long before I was on the scene. Conferences, various talks that people delivered. So it's actually a really valuable historical resource, even though it's still something that's ongoing today. If we fast forward to kind of the new millennium, we also get blog posts become a valuable place for seeing what people are interested in, social media as well. A lot of this stuff is still available on the open web. If it's not, a lot of it is either available in the Internet Archive Wayback Machine or in the various Internet archives that are being collected. British Libraries trying to collect that material now. And I like to think of these blog posts and the social media kind of as the gray literature of this space. So it's not the official publications, but there's a lot of conversations going on there. And from about 2003, we also see a growing number of scholars sharing copies of their syllabi online and course plans. And many of these are still available as well. So I've been going through some of these traces and trying to figure out and understand what digital history teaching looked like in the past 30 years or so. So I'd like to take you kind of through some of the things I found there. Before I do that, I want to say I am focusing on digital history, and I'm doing that for a couple of reasons. It's obviously a digital history seminar, but I think digital history has increasingly been drowned out by louder voices in the room who tend to be of the literary and linguistic variety within this DH or digital humanities world. And I think I've increasingly kind of felt like their conversations aren't the conversations that are interesting to me as a historian. So I thought it was important to have a distinct conversation that really focused on the needs of the historical world, as it's just different, I think. So that's the first reason. The second reason, I think there's been a lot of conversations about what DH is, and these have been going on for the past 6, 7, 8 years or so. I think often those are boring because they usually just tell you what the person writing is currently doing. So DH is whatever I do, and your DH is whatever you do. And I think that as a historian, it made sense to me to stop asking that question and instead say, well, what have people been doing? And this is what historians do. We look at the evidence as it changes over time. So it felt like a natural fit for me. So that's why I've taken this particular approach. So I want to give you a bit of a tour of what these digital history students in particular, I think, have been doing for the past few decades. And in order to do that, I'm gonna oversimplify things. So I'm gonna take down a bit of a whistle stop, and then we'll dig into some of the sources that I managed to come up with. And I want to start with statistics, because this is, as far as I've been able to discern, this is what people were talking about when they were talking about computers and the humanities or computers and history. And we can start this in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. So we're talking about the punch card driven machines of the era. And by and large, statistics are still what people are interested in the 1980s, if not later. And I think that's really a function of the fact that that's what computers were good at that stage. They were quite good at number crunching, quite good at sorting material, but they didn't have the same flexibility that some of the machines that we've got today do. So we're using these machines to do what they're good at, and I think that makes sense in a lot of ways. Now, there are, of course, textual scholars in the 1980s, so I don't want to pretend that there weren't people using computers for textual reasons, textual editing and things like that. But I think if we think back in the historiography about what historians are doing with computers, the big stories of the late 20th century are things like social history, economic history, demographic history. So basically people counting things, people graphing things, people doing regression analyses and statistically based stuff. So for example, when we've got, one of the things I came across is students at Dartmouth College in the United States. Hello.
Just checking.
You want to check the film, huh?
Yeah, I didn't. Is it started recording?
Oh, I have no idea.
I don't know. Probably not.
Sorry, we're just checking our other camera for those of you who are watching.
Okay, recording now.
We're good. Okay.
So now you're on film as well.
Yeah. We'll edit that out.
So we've got students at Dartmouth College in the United States in the late 1980s who were being asked to buy computers. And these are humanities students being asked to spend $1,500 to $2,400 each in the 1980s to buy computers to support their studies. And I think we can probably be fairly safe in our assumption that the historians amongst them were using that to do the types of statistical analyses that I've just described. So the calculator sense of computing as opposed to other approaches. You're not going to probably be able to see this from the back, but I think the same is true here in the UK. And this is an example I got from one of my colleagues named John Stiles of a course that he was planning in 1987 at the University of Bristol. And it was a computing for historians course. And in the outline, they decided they were going to split it into 3 key themes. The first was economic theory. The second was economic and social statistical analysis. And the third was economic and social data analysis. So that was a computing course that was designed here in the UK. Very clear sense that this is to help students use computers as a tool to do analyses about the past. 1980s, early 90s, we got a bit of a shift in teaching focus, and I think partly this is down to the rise of what we would call off-the-shelf software, which becomes more prevalent. You can readily buy statistical packages, so SPSS, some of you might be familiar with that. It's still used today in an updated form. We also get a number of database packages. And companies even begin to start advertising directly to historians when it comes to database programs. So I brought this book along because I was quite surprised to discover this. It's a book called History and Computing, edited by Peter Demley and Dean Hopkin, and it's from, I believe, 1987. And in the back of the book is the ad that you see on the screen here. They're trying to sell you a piece of software called Superfile for all your database needs, which I thought was quite an interesting new market that the computing world is seeing in historians. Get out there and buy our products. And I think this is a bit of a change in terms of what people think they need to do with computers. And in 2001, the quote on the screen there, Nancy Ide suggesting that we don't really need programming skills anymore because we've got this software that's come off the shelf. You can just start using it. So there's a shift in the skill set that's required for potential students. Now that becomes a controversial statement because, as you'll see shortly, we're still teaching people to program in these classes, or at least some people are. So not everybody's accepted that notion that we don't need to do it anymore. But I think actually one of the more interesting things that we're seeing here is that the change in what's being taught is not being driven by historians, it's being driven by Silicon Valley. So this is a change in what the computer can do, and historians are reacting in what they're offering the students. We are not setting a curriculum ourselves, and I wonder if that's changed today, and we can maybe discuss that a little bit later. I think the new millennium, when we push forward again, we start to get something even more complicated, in part because computers, I think, are getting more complex in what they can offer us, and people start using them in diverse ways. And I think this is also the time when we first start talking about digital history as opposed to older variations on that theme. And there's a few things that come along that particularly affect the digital history teaching again. And this is, the first of those is the internet. And you're going to tell me, well, that's not a new millennium thing. And you're right. But I think it starts to really affect what's being taught at this time. The second key thing that's going on is mass digitization of historical sources. So we're changing what's available to come into the classroom. And they, as I said, they're not new concepts, but they're really starting to kind of hit their stride in the late 90s and the early new millennium. And it kind of sounds silly to think about it today, but there were a number of people who we might think of as pioneers writing in this early decade of the 21st century on things that we would now, I think, take for granted. So the famous book by Dan Cohen and Roy Rosenzweig, which is on the screen here, Digital History, A Guide to Gathering, Preserving, and Presenting the Past on the Web, published in 2005, is really obvious today. I mean, it's basically about putting stuff online. We should put history online. And I don't think there are too many people who would disagree with that. But at the time, it was something that had to be, people had to be convinced of that. And that was what was one of the key conversations happening at this time. But it's a complete change from John Stiles' class at Bristol, where they're focused on economic theory and on doing historical research, because this doesn't have anything to do with research, what Cohen and Rosenzweig are suggesting. They're suggesting we share history, so they're talking about public history. And that's quite a difference, I think, between those earlier approaches. Same with the digitization of these historical resources. I don't think that's really a historical research skill that we're talking about. And a lot of that work was done in the GLAM industry. So galleries, libraries, archives, museums. These aren't historians that are necessarily driving it. That's not to say that there aren't historians that are actively involved in it. But it's something that requires the collection management skills of a different set of professionals than what historians are doing. But it's still being branded as a digital history activity, and I think that starts to complicate the narrative of what digital history is, and therefore, if you're learning about it, what do you need to know? It gets more complicated a few years later because we start to see people noticing that these digitized resources have provided new research potential. We've got all this stuff, what can we do with it? We start seeing people talking about big data and about data analysis as well. So we've got lots of things that start happening within basically a 10-year period, which start multiplying what constitutes digital history and complicating that pedagogical space as well. So rise of the internet, rise of Web 2.0, mass digitization, and then early notions of, hey, can we do some data analysis that we couldn't do before? So quite a distinct shift from the statistics focus of earlier cohorts. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've suggested there is no digital history curriculum, because instead what we get is kind of a mishmash of what people, individuals, were interested in, what they thought the digital skills were. And I think probably that often comes down to whatever they were doing. And generally speaking, you would only kind of be good at one, maybe two of these things rather than being good at all of them. And that, again, kind of makes us think, well, what is it that we need to teach our students? And maybe what we need to do is we need to remember some of the things that were being talked about in the earlier decades. So I've got a quote here from 1988 from a conference on digital pedagogy, which was held in Southampton. And it's about the idea that people are actually coming to study history when they're doing a history degree, and maybe we should remember that. So this is from Lou Bernard and Judith Proud, and what they say is, whilst new technology has a lot to offer the humanities, particularly teaching in the humanities, a great deal of caution and selection should be exercised in the manner and degree to which it is applied. So there's that kind of a warning there, like let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater when we're thinking about how we might change teaching. And we've had a lot of people that have kind of thought about some of these issues and what should we not be doing. And we see a lot of this in blog posts, in recent blog posts as well. So Mark Perry, for example, noted that students yawn at the field's arcane issues, like how to evaluate digital work in tenure decisions. So don't teach your undergraduate history students about your challenges getting tenure because you're a digital historian. Pretty obvious stuff, obviously. Ryan Cordell did a great talk, keynote talk in 2015 called How Not to Teach Digital Humanities. And it's about humanities. It was done in the literature department, but it was still, I thought, really cool because he managed to convince librarians that he could take live candles into the library so that his students could transcribe books as if they were in an old monastic, what are they called? Scriptorium. So they could appreciate the process of creating knowledge and transforming knowledge and understand that progression from the medieval monks right up to the modern day and ask what it is to study culture. So I thought that was a really interesting idea here. And it's also a reminder that we need to think about student engagement and student experience in the classroom as well. It's not just about getting stuff in their head. It's about thinking about the ways that they learn. Andrew Goldstone as well, this was just in January of this year, had a great blog post on how fast we should be doing digital skills teaching and this notion that you can't just cram it all in one class. This is something that has to percolate over a number of years and a number of courses and have it be across the curriculum. So there's lots of good stuff in that gray literature there about what we shouldn't be doing, and we should take heed of that when we see it and maybe share more often. Now, I'd like to switch focus a little bit because I want to spend the rest of my time with you today talking about digital history syllabi and what was actually happening in the classroom. Syllabi are not the classroom, obviously, but I think they're about as close as we can get in terms of a written historical record of what was going on. So in order to build some understanding, I went and did a bit of digging, and I've managed to put together a corpus of 126 digital history syllabi. These are only from Canada, the United States, and England, and they cover the period 2003 right up until this year, 2017. And what we've got is 83 unique courses and 43 that have been revised. Usually when they're revised, it's by the same instructor, but that's not necessarily always the case. Sometimes a few years down the line, somebody else takes it over. And I've done my best to kind of limit this to history departments, although sometimes it's difficult to tell. Now, these are all of the syllabi that I was able to find. They're not everything that ever existed because I had to be able to find it in order for me to include it. But I think this is a pretty good coverage of what was available, at least in the sense that I imagine I've got a good chunk of all universities who ever offered a digital history course, even if I don't have every instance of what they offered every year. Obviously, I don't have everything. Survivability really depended on whether or not an individual instructor decided to self-archive the material, because universities generally don't want old syllabi online. It's confusing to students because they do the wrong readings or they get confused. It also makes it look dated over time. So it really depends who is putting stuff up. And as it happens, William J. Turkel or Bill Turkel at Western University in Canada was by far the best at doing this. He self-archived every instance of every course that he ever taught on his research website. And actually, it was his class that I first took in digital history back in 2008, so that's where I kind of got into this as well. But he's unusual. As you can see here, nobody else comes close to this. The next closest we've got is Lincoln Mullen with 9, and he's in the United States. And in England, I had a hell of a time actually finding syllabi. I had to ask people because course management systems here are virtually all closed behind password protected walls. So I couldn't get anybody's other than my own, other than people that I individually knew were teaching and sent emails to get information on. So thank you to those of you who shared that. But it has left me with a bit of a gap in terms of what I know about English teaching, which is unfortunate. And that's, I think, increasingly going to be a problem for studies like this. So the first thing I want to share, you can almost read that, USA, Canada, England. First thing I wanted to say, this is a male-dominated space, at least in terms of people who were sharing their syllabi online. I didn't find any Canadian women who were doing so, so if you are a Canadian woman and you have them, let me know. But men outnumber women 49 to 15 in this space. We can talk about why or what that might mean in our discussion if you'd like, but I don't want to dwell on that too much at this stage. Secondly, in terms of geographical distribution, I was surprised by the relatively low number of institutions who were involved in this at all. If we include digital humanities courses, that looks a lot healthier, but a lot of that is literature stuff, so I've been selective here. And I think the literature teaching makes it look like we've got a lot more digital teaching than from a historian's perspective than we actually do. And this is surprising to me because despite the fact that I was able to find more than 1,000 places where you could study history degrees in these 3 countries, only a few handfuls have ever taught a digital history course that I was able to find. So that means that the vast majority of historians do not have formal training access to this material. And even within these 3 countries, I've got a bit of a heat map, which admittedly is kind of small, but you can download the slides later. The connection to the state of Virginia is absolutely overwhelming, particularly in the early years. So if we leave aside Bill Turkell's stuff that he was doing at Western University in Canada, the early adopters are almost all connected to Virginia in some way. So 2004, we've got University of Virginia. The same year, we've got Josh Greenberg is teaching at Cornell University, which is in New York, but he leaves immediately after that and goes and joins an institution in Virginia. The following year, George Mason University in Virginia starts teaching. University of Lincoln, Nebraska starts teaching. That's obviously not in Virginia, but it's taught by someone who had just arrived from Virginia. So Mary Washington University in Virginia. So until 2011, I actually don't have any syllabi from a place that wasn't connected to Virginia in some way other than Bill Turkell's stuff in Canada. And that wasn't until Kathy Moran at NYU and then Tim Hitchcock at Hertfordshire finally started something different. And I may have missed things, but that connection to Virginia is just really strong and quite striking because it suggests a very small core of people who probably knew each other personally are having a huge influence on what we're doing. The biggest group in terms of one institution, the largest number of syllabi was George Mason University in Virginia, and they had 28. And this is the home of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, so perhaps that's not surprising. Bill Turkell at Western University. Western University had 26, 24 of those were Bill Turkell's. So it's pretty much a one-man show in that case. And in England, we max out at about 3, so a lot lower. I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that it's happening a bit later, or it seems to be happening a bit later. So again, that's something that we might want to talk about. Can we read these almost? Can you read those? Yeah. I also wanted to talk about who's not teaching it. And one of the striking things is that the research-intensive universities seem not to be teaching this stuff. The Ivy League in the United States, which is supposedly the cream of the crop, 4 of them are on there, which is pretty good. I think Harvard, Cornell, Columbia, Pennsylvania all have at least 1 class. The other 4 did not, so Princeton, Dartmouth, Brown, and Yale, or at least I didn't find them. Doesn't mean they never had one, but I didn't find them. That doesn't mean they're not doing any digital work, because I'm sure some of you know the Women's Writers Project, for example, had been running at Brown for many years. But that's not something that was, I believe that was a literature initiative, and therefore I don't think it was something that was directly engaging necessarily with the historians. So maybe that's why they didn't have a course on it. Canada is not doing nearly as well as the Americans in terms of the elite universities. So Western University is the only one that shows up there. The classification there is called the medical doctoral universities. So these are the ones that tend to do the majority of PhD training. And then in England, we have not a single Russell Group institution who is offering one of these courses, at least, again, as I said, as I was able to find. I think that's a problem for a couple of reasons, because I think generally these so-called top schools disproportionately feed people into the future professoriate. So we've got potential sustainability problems. This stuff isn't going to filter in unless it starts being taught where people are going to become university lecturers. I think it also suggests that the vast majority of universities still don't see digital history as something that's central enough to what they do to bother to put this onto their curriculum. And again, I think that has implications for future growth for the field. So I suppose there's one of our problems that we can think about, is that this stuff is still not being widely taught. Let's think about content as well. So what's being taught? Is it changing over time? So in order to answer some of those questions, I've done some classification. I did a close reading of all of the syllabi that was in this collection here. And I classified them into 3 different types of categories. So the first one is the balance between history and digital. So is this a history course? Is it a digital course? Is it somewhere in the middle? And I'll go through each of these in turn. The second one is the type of digital history that we're trying to teach. I've gone through a bit of an overview of that in my whirlwind tour, but I'll go into more depth in just a minute. And then the third one is just some specific looks. So things that I was seeing a lot, and then so I went back over and tried to determine how often is this stuff actually popping up. So just to give you an example of that, we see a lot of blogging. So how prevalent is blogging amongst these modules? So I'll start with the degree of historical emphasis here, the balance between history and digital teaching. And this one, I was quite surprised by this actually, because there is shockingly little history being taught in digital history classes, at least over the entire period. So I've gone through each of the unique courses on offer here and classifying the extent to which history is the core focus of what's going on here, as opposed to digital. And in order to be classified as having a high category, so this green circle here, a high historical emphasis, I decided that a course had to make digital secondary to the history. So this had to be something that would look very much at home in a history department, that if you were kind of looking at it, you could reasonably say this is a history course. And only 11 out of those 83 unique courses could pass muster as a history class. And the first one that I was able to find was by Cameron Blevins at Stanford University in 2012, where he taught a class on the history of the American West. And what he did was he used a series of digital approaches, almost like case studies, to explore that topic through digital approaches and help the students understand the history of the American West. So the goal is very much about understanding history, the way that we tend to teach historical topics more broadly, but he's drawing on those things such as mapping, textual analysis, network analysis, and thinking about power and space. In his description, he notes, and I'll just quote him here, by pairing traditional forms of historical analysis with cutting-edge technological tools, the class will explore how competing visions of the West played out in the mental maps of 19th century Westerners and non-Westerners. So it's a history class, but it's a history class that uses the digital elements to teach the students in a new way. This is a fairly new approach. 2012 was the first one. It's also the one that has proved to be most popular in England, from what I've been able to discern. And in fact, most of the English syllabi that were taught this year seem to take this approach. So for example, Bob Nicholson is one of our colleagues up at Edge Hill University. He teaches what he calls traditional modules on the history of crime and journalism, but he does it in a computer lab, and digital skills are kind of incorporated in what he does, but the focus is still on that historical theme. One of Justin's colleagues, Lisa Smith, also a historian, she's Canadian by right and by birth, but she's teaching here in the UK, and she's got a class called the Digital Recipes Project. And again, it's it's focusing on the history as opposed to necessarily the digital, but it's definitely embedded in what she's doing. And it's interesting because this recent development of history first really kind of goes back to what was going on in the 1980s when historians were using it to do history, to do research in a way that wasn't necessarily the focus in the middle period, as I'll discuss. And I was kind of reflecting on, well, why is this happening in England? Why is this the focus in England? And I suspect it might be down to some of the pressures that English scholars face with regards to publishing and things like ref, where people in North America will tell me there's tons of pressure to publish. But I think my impression as a North American is it seems to be more constant here. You spend your entire career under pressure to keep publishing, whereas I've seen many profiles of North American scholars who got their tenure and kind of decided to stop publishing for a decade. So I wonder if that continued emphasis on research in the English system has translated into the classroom as well. And I think also my impression coming here, having done my undergraduate in Canada, my sense is that the undergraduate students in history degrees here are taught almost like researchers in training in a way that they're not in North America. In North America, a history degree, I think, is more likely to be seen as a way of instilling good citizenship and empathy and living and creating and understanding society. So there's a different view about what the purpose of a history degree is. But I thought it was interesting to point out that this seems to be a fairly English phenomenon, particularly because here we are in England. In terms of the moderate category, the red one next to it here, these are courses that have some kind of a historical theme, but more of a digital emphasis. So it's swinging slightly more to the digital side of things. And this becomes much more common about 2012. It's also much more likely to be an American approach. This is much more common in American classrooms. And what I found really interesting about this is that these themed classes overwhelmingly were adopting local history topics. And it was more likely to be a local history than something of interest to the instructor. So they're not even using their own research interest. It's like, let's do the local history of this area and put the material online. So I've got a few examples of this. Leslie Madsen Brooks, 2014. She's at Boise State University, and the students had to create a local history of what she calls the Central Rim neighborhood. And this is the neighborhood where the university happens to be. So they're creating an exhibit that tells some of the local history. And we see this time and again. Adina Langer, Atlanta Beltline at Georgia State University. So the Beltline being the ring road around Atlanta. So the students are focusing very much on that local history of where they decided to go to school. And there's a great example as well. Fred Gibbs, who was one of my former colleagues on the programming historian, he moved to the University of New Mexico in, I think, 2013. And when he put on his digital history course, decided to do that local history thing in his adopted city of Albuquerque. So it had nothing to do with his research interests at all, but it was, let's find something that we can all connect to. Even more local than that, I found 3 examples of American universities where they were challenged to research their own university. So we're not even leaving campus. It's let's research us. And one of them in particular, Ann Mitchell Wisnant in 2014, had the students dig into the white male personas who all the buildings had been named after. So let's understand all these old dead white guys who we've named all the buildings from. So that really kind of interesting local focus of American digital history. I only found one class that had historiography in the reading list, but no theme. So they're using historiography, but no obvious theme to tie it all together. I call that a low emphasis. And I think the most striking thing for me is that 40 out of 83, nearly half of these, nothing obviously historical in them whatsoever. And this is despite the fact that these are targeted at historians. So there's a really interesting thing going on there, because what we're getting is a message that digital historians don't teach history. And we might want to ask ourselves if that's a good thing or not. The second set, classification, is looking at what type of teaching are we looking at here. And this is what form of digital history are we interested in? And it's possible at this stage for you to have more than one. So these don't equal up to 83 like the previous one. So you could have your toe in a couple of things here. If we look at this kind of chronologically between categories that became popular over time, I'll start with the quantitative side of things. Cliometrics and quantitative research methods. So this is very much the statistical stuff that we were talking about from the 80s and the 90s and even earlier than that. And emphatically, this is not being taught in digital history courses. I only found rudimentary statistics in 3 out of 83 courses. 2 of those were offered by conveners of this seminar. And they're not even central to what's going on. I mean, they're almost throwaways in the fact that they're there. So James Baker here, University of Sussex, includes Pat Hudson's History by Numbers on his reading list. As far as I'm aware, that's the extent of how far he's gone into it. You can correct me later if we're wrong. But that's one of the success stories of engaging with quantitative history. Melody Beals, who I believe is listening to us from California, she's also one of our conveners. She had a session in which she taught students how to create a column graph using data that she provided them in Microsoft Excel, and then they can do some fairly basic visualization and understanding fairly simple numbers, I think. And then the third case is Thomas Friedman included, and that was an American example, including a week on what he called quantitative analysis. So that was probably the most substantial case that I came across. So this is a dramatic rejection of this quantitative analysis of these earlier historians. There's a clear line being drawn here saying that's not what we do, that's not who we are. We can talk about why that is, perhaps, in the discussion. I think if I was going to be provocative, I would suggest it's because most of us don't know statistics well enough to actually teach it. The second category here, by far the biggest, the red one here, public history or digital public history, 53 out of 83. So a majority of these are digital public history. This is overwhelmingly the way that Canadian and American scholars are teaching digital history courses. And by digital public history, I mean an emphasis not on doing history, but on using the web to engage with audiences and presenting it to people who might be interested in historical content. So this is about building web archives, about building exhibits. And this is so common in North America, particularly until about 2014, that if somebody told you they were teaching a digital history course, you can almost assume that that's what they were doing at that time in North America. Not as common in England, although I'll admit I did do that when I first started teaching digital history, perhaps because of my North American background. And again, I wonder if that's, again, because of the pressures of the ref and the way that English historians see themselves as principally as researchers, and students are researchers in training. And the people that do the public history work maybe aren't the same ones that are working within the history departments, and therefore that's not trickling into the system in the same way. I don't know, that's just speculation. Despite the fact that everybody seems to be doing digital public history, at least in North America, they're not all doing it the same way. So there is quite a lot of variation within individual modules. Some of them focus very much on web design. So how do you do an effective website, particularly if we think 10, 15 years ago when it was more difficult to do web design and you had to know a lot more than you have to know today. But then on the other hand, we've got Bill Turkel had a class that he ran a number of times called Interactive Exhibit Building. Which is, again, public history, but it was focused on, it was part of a public history MA, and it was focused on teaching the students to build interactive museum displays. So using physical computing devices, teaching them how to program these things that would do stuff. And this stuff could be beeping or moving or a light turning on, or just something to go beyond that notion of a museum text panel that is completely uninteractive. So still public history focused, but very different than the web design skills that you'd be getting in other courses. The third category here in the middle, the yellow one, 24, this is building tools. This is a category where I've included 2 different things here. So both programming, so learning to program so you can build a tool, build some software of your own, and courses that talk about programming in a way that suggests maybe you might want to do this. So this is about the process of creating a digital tool that will do stuff to stuff and give you a result. On the fourth category here, the blue one, data analysis. Data analysis is more about using someone else's tool. So there's a difference there between are you going to build it or are you going to use it? And there's implications there about what type of a digital historian I think you are. more common to see the data analysis than the programming. And I think maybe we can suggest that that's because it's easier to get students to use other people's tools than it is to teach them enough programming to create something viable and useful within the amount of time that you get for a course. But the fact that 24 out of 84, so about a quarter of these courses are teaching or talking about programming, suggests that Nancy Ide's claim from 2001 that we don't need it anymore has been rejected by a significant number of these educators. The tool using, one of the things I would just to pick up on what I said earlier, one of the things I would say is perhaps problematic of this is that they tend to be quantitatively based, but we're not teaching the quantitative skills to interpret these responsibly, because only James has any quantitative, or Melody has any quantitative skills on their courses. So we're teaching people to use tools without teaching them how to interpret the results. And I've used this example before in this seminar, but Rebecca Kozner's been writing about what she calls trusting others to do the maths. And this is, of course, used pejoratively towards digital humanities scholars as just assuming that the mathematics are all right and that I don't need to know that stuff. And I think that's quite alarming, actually, when we see the extent to which some of this stuff is being taught. Digital tools actually become the mainstay by 2013, so they're really starting to replace those public history courses that I described a minute ago. So we've got shifts happening here. So we start in the 80s, we've got the numbers, we end up with a large emphasis on public history, and we've got a shift then coming into these digital tools. So there's a change happening over time. The final category, the purple category here, 41, so about half of them. I call this a wide survey approach or a shotgun approach to teaching digital history. And I think this is a good-natured attempt to do everything in one class or one course. So you might teach HTML one week, and then the next week you come back and do sentiment analysis, and then principles of design. So it's a little bit from kind of everywhere, and there's not necessarily coherence to tie it all together. I think that's raising some problems for students in terms of what is it that what are we learning here? What are the actual learning objectives? And we might think of it as, as I said, a good-natured attempt of a colleague to try to put in all the skills that they think the students need, but they're not getting from everyone else in the department, and do it all in one go. And we might want to reflect on how effective that is. There was a really interesting example from one of my colleagues, Ian Milligan, and he had a class in 2014 in which he allowed students to choose quite broadly on their final project. So they had a choice between a historical website, public history, a textual analysis, so data analysis, or creating a tool in Python. So basically, any of these categories, whatever one you are interested in, you can do your final project on. And this pluralist approach becomes really quite common in the last 4 years or so. And I think that's partly because those of us who are coming into this teaching look around and see all these different types of teaching and think maybe we've got to do it all. But it's something that by 2017, just last year, seems to have been rejected quite heavily. And we've had this move back towards these history-first courses. And I wonder if that's because students weren't taking them, or because they just lacked coherence, or people realized it didn't work, whatever it was. But for a few years there was this just peppering students with everything that they might need to know. And I think maybe thankfully that's starting to fade away. Specific content, just a few things that were popping up lots and I thought would be worth kind of digging into a little bit more. The public history courses were particularly characteristic of project-based teaching and assessment. So this is the most uniting thing in a digital history course, is the fact that you are probably not expected to write an essay. You are going to do a project. And what that project is varies rather widely. Some of them are solo initiatives, and that I think mirrors very well on what historians tend to do in class. Go off to the library and work on your own. But there's also quite a lot of group work as well. And there were some interesting initiatives, even quite early, on helping students to pick up those group work skills. So back in 2008, Jeff McClurkin in the United States came up with an idea of a collaborator's contract. So this is getting the students together to talk about their working styles and their expectations for each other and how they were going to solve problems if conflicts arose. And that's not something you're typically going to find in a history curriculum, I don't think. But it's incredibly valuable when we're talking about some of the digital projects and the collaborative working that people do here. So I thought that was an interesting example. Blogging is also very common. Blogging is, we've got 44 blogging examples, so about half of them are doing that. The first example that I was able to find was Josh Greenberg in 2004 at Cornell. He then went to George Mason University the following year and took the practice with him, and it started to spread from there because everybody at George Mason started blogging in about 2005, and it just started appearing and percolating around these courses. And I'm not entirely sure that people knew why they were putting it on the courses. At least I'm not convinced that they knew, because virtually nobody says why they're doing it. It's just one of those things that, well, I blog, so naturally, as a digital historian, if you want to be a digital historian, you need to blog too. And there was one exception to that I was able to find, and that was Bill Turkel, who credits a book from 1983 called The Reflective Practitioner by Donald Schoen. And it's this notion of we get better by reflecting on how things went. And I think actually that's what we're asking people to do when we're asking them to write blogs. But instead of calling it reflective practice, it was called blogging. And I wonder if that's maybe why it didn't percolate outside of digital history and into the history classes. So if we had sold it in a different way and actually, ironically, reflected on why we were asking students to be reflective, it may have gone beyond digital history. Of course, that's kind of falling away now. People aren't blogging as much on these courses. I think a lot of digital historians as well aren't blogging as much. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't doing some interesting things for a while. So Sean Graham, who's based at Carleton in Canada, decided to use it as a way to create a learning community for the students. So he set aside 20% of their grades for communicating on each other's blogs and helping each other to work through their ideas. And I thought that was kind of an innovative idea. And it's something that you can do through message boards and forums and discussion groups in other ways. But it was that notion of having the students talk to each other outside of the classroom. There's also been some interesting examples of creating intra-institutional teaching. So there's a couple of historians in Texas, Andrew Torgett and Caleb McDaniel. They were at 2 different Texas universities, and they decided to teach their courses on the same theme at the same time and have the students act almost as pen pals to one another. So they were working on the history of slavery, and as the students were working on their projects, they were sharing them in progress with the other group and breaking down those traditional barriers between institutions. And I know Lisa Smith at Essex is doing that as well. She's been working with people at Pennsylvania, so that's actually going internationally, and it's something I think would be cool if we see more of. I don't know if it's digital, but it seems to have been something that has at least been tested out by digital people. Also common, the yellow circle here is 31 out of 83. Dan Cohen and Roy Rosenzweig's Digital History. The book is on a lot of syllabi, and this is despite the fact that I think it's now quite questionably useful, particularly if you're not teaching that digital public history style, because it's really just about how to put stuff online. And we've all got machines in our pocket that can do that now. So do we still need this on the reading list? I'm not convinced. I imagine Dan would probably admit as well that maybe we don't. But it interestingly doesn't fall off. It tends to stay on. Once it's on, it stays there, which is interesting. And then the last category there is just historiography, and historiography would be the mainstay of the history course generally, but only a quarter of these courses had any historiography on them, which again is this notion that digital historians don't talk to historians, which potentially is a problematic message to be sending to the students, that we're the only ones in the history department who aren't talking to historians in a traditional way. And instead of these historiographical journal articles and books, instead what we see is blog posts and technical readings and generally free stuff that's available online. Free seems to be quite common. So just to kind of tie this up and bring it back together into a bit of a trajectory, because I told you I was going to tell you a history, and history needs to have a narrative arc to it. So we tend to see waves happening here. Starting with the statistical computing of the early era, moving into digital public history, and then once we get to the present, we start to get the waves get shorter, or at least I've got better at noticing them. So there's shorter waves of people trying out different things. I don't get a great sense that there's a lot of engagement backwards with the previous groups. It's almost like every group comes and says, you know, we just discovered this great new thing called a computer, and we're going to be the first historians to use this, and everybody look at what we've done. And this, I think that's a problem. I mean, I call this the eternal present problem, that everybody thinks that they're coming to this new. And that cuts short the long conversations that our colleagues are having in the rest of the historical profession that go back decades, and we just don't have that tradition, which might be problematic. I think one of the things that I found quite concerning was the lack of quantitative skills that are being taught. And I think that's something that we might need to figure out how to address as a community, particularly if we're going to continue teaching these tools. But I think one of the things I was quite excited to see was my colleagues, some of whom are in this room, going back to the history first approach of teaching and making it about what the students actually came to and trying to appeal to their interest in history as a way into this stuff. And I'm personally hoping to see more of that as we move forward. I think that ties in with the philosophy of this seminar, where we've always tried to get people to tell us how your history, how your research changes history, rather than just telling us how you made your database. So I think there's a lot of potential, there's a lot of problems. Hopefully I've thrown out some things that we can maybe talk about here. But what I wanted to leave you with is just a selection here of syllabi that I said that are worth reading. I put myself on there, not because I think it's the best example, but because it's the only English one that's available openly on the web. And I thought we need to have at least one. But I think if you went through these, you'd have a pretty good sense of how digital history teaching has changed, the multiplicity of types of digital history teaching that have been going on, and also some of the really cool examples of people doing some innovative things. And I wouldn't have put my own on there if everybody else had put theirs up on the internet. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you for your attention. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts and some of the things I'm totally wrong about. Because I'm sure there are some. Okay.
Cool, thank you, Adam. I've got several questions myself, but I will first off open to the audience, and James will jump in then. All questions from Twitter.
I will do later, but not yet.
Anyone in the room?
I'll start then. Okay, so I have, there's no online, but I have kind of 2 comments and 2 questions. So the first comment is about syllabi, so I'm sorry, and I will find better ways of making my syllabi available. And the second comment is to do with quant, which is, I think, that I totally agree with the point that the tools increasingly that we use to find online resources are presenting things with numbers and numerical systems, and that I feel as though trying to get at quant through that has been the thing I'm trying to work at, and the thing I think is most likely to engage students, which is there are a bunch of numbers down the left-hand side of your screen when you search for stuff. How do we critically evaluate these, and how do we think about the quantitative stuff going under the hood? And for me, that feels like the way in, as opposed to starting with let's teach you R or SPSS. But anyway, the 2 questions. The first question is a really short one, actually, which is you talked about UK people doing more history first, and your argument was that maybe that's because of publishing. I wonder whether that's because we have a greater emphasis on very structured from the top down the university learning outcomes with our degrees. So our degree has a series of learning outcomes which are about learning about history, and my modules have to have a series of learning outcomes to do with history, and history first fits the learning outcomes. The module on digital history does not fit the learning outcomes of the degree. And so I really can't justifiably pitch one. It doesn't fit what the students sign up for when they come to university. The other question was more a broader question, which is that I'm really surprised you didn't use the word archive at any point during the last hour. And I'm really surprised that...
I did say glam, and then I expanded, so archive was one of those...
Well, I didn't mean in terms of the archives. I meant in terms of it. I wonder whether there's another way you could have looked at a number of these syllabi in terms of their engagement with the notion of the archive. So if they're not necessarily thinking about history and looking at, say, history first, they might actually be trying to get students to think about how the archive's constructed through, for example, them constructing archives through, say, Omeka Online, to reflect on the practice of construction of archives and how that then influences their work as historians. And so that may not have come through because they're not actually writing out the syllabi, but for me, that, again, I feel as though that's one of the ways that I'm trying to teach, is about getting to be critical about the archive through digital.
And remixing the archive as well, because if you go into the archive, they won't let you put stuff in different boxes, will they? But when you do that in digital format, you can completely change the way that everything is ordered. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I didn't use that word. I think I've kind of bunged that into the public history category of my catch-all of, you're not doing research, but you are working with primary sources to tell a story in some kind of a way. And maybe that's an inappropriate category, but it made sense to me. It was the distinction between what happens in the library and the archive and the public history realm, and what happens in the I need to get my article in past and present world of the historians. So yeah, you're right. Maybe it's too broad of a category in that regard, and it is difficult to tell. As I said, these aren't what happened in class. They're the documents that people give to students to say what they think they're going to be doing in class. And some of them were a lot more detailed than others, so you can get a much better sense. And in some of them, you can actually read the class blogs, so you can see what they really were doing, even the conversations they were having. And there's a great example of one at George Mason University, where one of the students decided to design sweatshirts to celebrate their class experience together. So they were blogging about the sweatshirts. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a copy because they were no longer available. But yeah, they're using it in lots of different ways, and I think you're right about the archive being one of those different ways that I didn't really touch on. The learning outcomes and the degrees. You know, I've never worked academically in a North American university, so I couldn't comment if that was different there than it is here. I've been a student in North American universities, but I don't know if there's more of an emphasis on those learning outcomes or not. It's possible.
You use the expression principles of design. What did you mean by that? And does that have a history that you know about?
Principles of design. Well, I think what I was thinking in that is, if you're going to build a website and you want it to look nice, you should think about these things. So it's really skills that are web design skills that are being taught to historians as digital history skills. And they're useful skills for humans to have if you want to communicate visually with making a nice website. But I'm not sure they're digital history skills unless we define digital history as putting history up on the internet. And there is a history of that, but it tends to be in kind of visual art theory and photography rather than in history. So I mean, I teach my students this sometimes, actually, the rule of thirds, which is, if you want somebody to look at a picture and you want it to be interesting, make sure that the interesting stuff falls on certain points on the screen that are kind of here, 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 and here. And if for whatever reason, human eyes tend to like that. It's not a history skill, though, is it? But it's something that we're teaching in digital history classes.
Go back to one of James's points and maybe think about the connection of the very proud Tef Silver mark that you've got on your PowerPoint slide there, and maybe think about what that might say about the pressures on the syllabus and what.
Do you think that's having a pressure now?
My perception is that there's a lot more focus on what the students want,
right,
rather than what the students need. And that might have something to do with the tendency you've seen, especially in England, the past few years, for history first. Because certainly my experience has been that students are more conservative, especially as they get towards the third year of their degree.
Right.
Project versus essay. I've had students tell me they're not going to take my module because it's not accessible in essay. And they've spent 3 years being trained how to write an essay. Why should they have to learn a new set of skills?
Yeah, and for us in this space, I think that suggests that we have to think about what my colleagues call digitizing the curriculum and making sure that this stuff is sprinkled throughout the curriculum at all levels, rather than give them something that's terrifying in their final year where 50% of your grade depends on this group project you're going to do with these knuckleheads you've never met or that you don't trust. And yeah, so there's a lot of pressure on that, isn't there? And you're right about the conservative nature. And again, I think this is a particularly English thing. The pressure to get a first or a 2-1, a good grade on your degree, is very high here. And there's almost this sense that if you don't get a 2-1, which for those of you who don't know what that means, it basically means a B or a pretty good grade. If you don't get that, your life is over. So they become very risk averse to anything that looks different. And you're right, they want the essay and they want things that look familiar. So you're probably right that I suspect some of these courses that started 4 or 5 years ago have shifted into these because they needed to recruit more.
Yeah. And
it was a way to justify putting on a digital history course and kind of hiding it. It's like putting your medicine in a piece of cake so that nobody notices it's there. And I know from speaking to colleagues who have put on digital courses, not necessarily just in history, that they put together a course they thought it was going to be the best thing ever, and then nobody took it and it didn't run. And it was because it looked so different that it panicked the students. Yeah.
Yeah. There's another uniquely English thing which I think has an impact on this, which is A-levels.
And the training,
the specialization.
Specialization early, yeah. Yeah, they don't, yeah, I agree with you. In my experience, they don't come in ready to explore lots of different topics. Whereas when I did my history degree in Canada, I had to take a math or science class as part of the degree. It was a requirement for a humanities degree. I took a psychology class, I took classics, I took philosophy, I took from across the spectrum. And when I was doing my PhD at a university I won't mention right now, the history students literally only took history classes their entire way through the degree. And I found that just shocking compared to what I had to go through. So you're right, the system filters very early. So that risk averse, I think, definitely would come into it. Whereas perhaps in the North American model, they're more willing to say, oh, I'll try that, that looks neat. That's different, but there's no risk to me doing poorly on one module. Yeah, exactly. Okay.
We've got a few questions online, so I'll pick up. I want to pick up a little bit on Melody Beals, one of our conveners, has a couple of questions. One is to do with, which is similar to what's already been mentioned, so I'll mention it here, whether there's concerns such as uptake, student interest, types of history the department teaches, and whether that's actually shaping things rather than student feedback. And so that's kind of come up there. And one of the things that struck me about that is that it's very hard to share with each other the feedback we're getting from students and how we are massaging our modules to fit with the feedback that we're getting. And I think I'm learning a lot on that. I'm sure we all are. So finding forums to anonymously share some of that feedback, I think, would be very useful. But she also asked, to what extent do you think that the shape of the modules are being dictated by program directors, or the perception, I guess, of what they will say about history, sort of digital history modules? Which is a similar question, but
yeah. I think on the feedback and the changes, yeah, it almost suggests we need an oral history here as well, don't we? So there's that chance to kind of feed into this in a way that you don't get by just me passively looking at your syllabus. And the fact that most of us are still alive means that it's one of those things that can still be done. There is I didn't dig into it, but you can actually see how modules change by looking at the same module year after year. So for example, Bill Turkel drops blogging after 10 years on his course. So it's done for 10 years, all of a sudden it just quietly disappears. And I think that reflects the fact that he stopped blogging, that some of the big bloggers stopped blogging, and it seemed less central to what was happening. So we can pick at it a little bit in that way, but without talking to each other, it is quite difficult to pick up on some of that stuff. In terms of being shaped by colleagues, I'm sure this stuff is being shaped by colleagues, specifically because it seemed to me that most of these syllabi were by people who were fairly early in their careers. And therefore, they might have been some of the first courses that they were putting together on their own. And I can only assume that they had people looking over their shoulders and giving feedback. And I only found a couple of examples of people actually reflecting on that. And I can't remember his name now, but there was an American example where he said he tried to put a course on and they said no, because his learning objectives didn't make sense or weren't deep enough or hadn't been thought through enough. And he was pissed off at the time, but a couple of years later, reflecting on it, he kind of agreed, well, they were right, and it would have been a terrible course, and I'm glad that we didn't go ahead with it. So yeah, the fact that I think a lot of this is being led from the relative youth of the early career might mean that there's a lot of sculpting from above, and when things don't recruit, probably pressure from above to change and to adapt as well.
The other question we got from online is from FD Laramie, who says, "Would love to know the graduate undergraduate split for these history first courses." I guess we could talk about that across the rest. I wonder whether there's any graduate courses in these at all, actually.
Not in the UK, or sorry, England. I haven't done the UK, England. Not in England. They're all undergraduate, as far as I was able to tell. I think that is part of the culture of higher education, how it's different here. There tends to be more research focused, more independent research, although not exclusively. There were a few in the United States, and Bill Trakell's stuff, a lot of that was done at master's level within a public history program, which I happened to take, actually. I was a student on that program. But I didn't dig into that too deeply, so I don't know the answer. But there definitely was some, it was the history first that he was interested in. History first, since that was primarily an English phenomenon, that was primarily an undergraduate thing. Yeah. But there definitely was graduate stuff happening, but it was happening predominantly in the United States. And I think probably public history focused generally.
There are a few digital history MAs running in Britain on that. What kind of modules are they?
Digital history, I mean, okay, I didn't get the syllabi then. I missed those ones. Can you send me the link?
I know of them, but I don't
Okay.
know details themselves.
Yeah, I'd probably have to specifically ask for them, because I imagine they're using a content management system like Blackboard or something where I wouldn't be able to get into them. So yeah, I didn't get everything, but I don't know. When we do stuff at Hertfordshire, it's by research, so it's an individual project that a student wants to do. So if they want to do digital history, it wouldn't have a syllabus. It would just be part of that research process.
There was a digital history MA that was authorised at Essex, never actually ran,
Okay.
which was very quant skills heavy.
Was it? Oh, I'd love to see your paperwork if you give it to me.
It was with the UK Data Archive.
Okay.
Staff
Oh,
changes.
so quite a few years ago.
Staff changes then that didn't happen.
Ah, okay.
Sorry, the question
Yes. I wonder whether historians are in fact the most conservative of academic bunches gathered together.
Very good question.
If you're dealing, which is what I was doing, which is what does a planner need to know about the past of a place in order to be able to make a plan which is going to be flyable rather than sinkable, means you need to teach planners about how to understand and do history in order to make, this is why I asked the question about design decisions, in order to make design decisions,
Right.
which will somehow or other play the game of all the political parties around the table. And really, I mean, my story of this goes back to 1975, when I logged into Lockheed Dialogue's ERIC database, which was the biggest available electronically accessible database in 1975. And I discovered that you could do a Boolean AND in a way in which I'd never thought before you could do it. I mean, before then, you had things called quick quat, and you could do things by holding cards up against a light box and see where the little lights showed through. And that told you which records to go and have a look at. And suddenly, with Lockheed Dialogue on ERIC, I could do a Boolean and know the difference between a Boolean and a Boolean OR. Now, in 1975, I'm not sure how many people knew that sort of stuff, never mind knowing how to do it. But to show a bunch of planners that they could search their historical collection in a way in which we hadn't been able to do before, started a path. And my story of that path is quite different from yours. And so we could produce two tables and we could run those tables in parallel. And it was a bit of an accident last weekend. The Bartlett, which is a school of planning here, was having an exhibition of what their master's students were doing on urban design. And my impression was they were clueless. They didn't have a clue about how to make a project fly by getting enough history. Now, inevitably, I'm bending the stick because the person who's building the DP World down at Thames Gateway is utterly uninterested in history. He's just digging an extremely big hole in order to get a lot of container ships in there. And because that's the bang for buck that's being played, nobody's interested in history. But there will then be a bit of collateral damage. And so some people will go scuttling around like vultures, the edges of the project, and find some goodies that they can pick up on. And so the chief executive of DP World does an environmental impact assessment study in which he talks about the fact that they're 12 miles from the M25. He doesn't appear to know that they've got a railway line running there, and that actually he would use a railway line rather than the trucks going to the M25, because it simply hasn't impacted his mind at all. Now, there's a borderline here between planning and history and something we have to call something different. I call it radical designology, but it seems to me that the historian inside the historian silo isn't going to achieve very much at all, actually. You've got to be engaged in cutting some other crops in order to bring the bread home, if that's not a dreadfully mixed metaphor.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, historians are very insular as well, aren't they, within the departments, and that's, maybe we should be learning from this digital public history approach that's being used in North America to get out and engage with communities more, and doing some of these local projects to convince the students to go talk to the business owners down the street and to figure out how what they're doing can impact on the communities. And it's not something that's as embedded, I think, here as it is in that North American model. So maybe British historians are concerned. But I don't think many of them would see that as an insult. They wear that as a badge of pride. There you go. Yeah.
Right. Any more questions?
I do have a question, actually, which is kind of like, so a big framing question. So if we took digital history as a method, my question is, do other methods within history go about writing their histories? So do people who do oral histories have histories of how oral history was being taught and the failures and successes of that, and whether that is a useful thing to know about in terms of comparing to this? Because there are, they go around teaching students how to use a tape recorder. If we took digital history as a kind of an approach, broadly speaking, or a field, is this a very digital history thing to do? Do Americanists go around writing histories or thinking about the histories of how they teach American studies? And that's neither of those are criticisms, but they're more about the fact that the first one is really about, do other people who do technical methods really kind of think about the change in their practice, or do they just instinctively go for it? And so actually we're doing something very constructive here. And the second is really about, well, does this make digital history stand out by virtue of the fact that we are talking about having histories of our pedagogy, and that we're not just getting on with the pedagogy, perhaps? So, the pedagogical space here is being separated out from the rest of history teaching to think about what we're doing in digital history.
Yeah, I didn't come across any other histories of modern histories anyway of teaching, but there are a lot of histories of subdisciplines within history. So there's lots of examples of the history of social science in the last 30 years, for example, which I think this kind of worked. It's just more of a modern variant on that.
It is specific to teaching as well.
No, it tends to be focused on research as opposed to teaching. I have also been doing stuff on the research end of things, but what I chose to talk about today was on the teaching side. And I think probably for me, the reason that I'm interested in that is because I've been involved with called Programming Historian, which is about teaching people to teach themselves digital skills. And so we, being the people on the team, which includes James now, have thought a lot in the last 10 years about how to get technical skills into people's toolkits. So for me, I think maybe that's why I find this a particularly worthwhile space to reflect upon. But there's a field of the history of education, but I'm not sure if it goes into the 21st century. I don't know. I haven't dug deeply enough to really know that. So maybe this is part of that notion of the reflective practitioner that I was talking about, and coming out of the bloggingness of, I had a blog for years. Bill Turkel made me start a blog as part of the class that I took. So maybe that's embedded in what we do. We stop and we look at what we're doing more than some of our colleagues. But there definitely are histories of history and of historical practice. So I haven't invented anything there.
Pretty sure I've read some things by economic historians reflecting on
the practice of teaching economic history. Okay, that'd be really interesting to look at, actually.
Mainly commiserating over the history departments,
right,
etc.
And how horrible the statistical skills of their undergraduates are, and why aren't they better prepared by them? Moaning, we all moan, don't we? So we do.
I'll just finish one note I made there, which is probably worth talking about. On your graph, 2014 is the peak, and it went down from there. Is that something you're going to read? Or is that actually, Is it because the history first ones are making it harder for you to find them?
I think content management systems are making it harder for me to find them. I think it's increasingly, well, there's two things. I think increasingly universities are requiring people to put them into course management systems, and in my case, I don't even have to create the equivalent of a syllabus anymore, because it's filling in a series of boxes so that everything's uniform across the university. So the document of the syllabus doesn't exist in the same way. I think also the decline of blogging and the letting go of the personal research website, because we just don't need it as much as we used to anymore, means that people aren't self-archiving these things in the way that they used to. So I wouldn't read that to say necessarily that they are declining, because I teach 2 history first courses at the minute, and I have to wonder if they're digital history courses or not, because they're so history first that I've got an assignment that I think is kind of digital history, but that's the extent of it. So yeah, I think they are included in it. I haven't in this. No, I did include my much more obviously digital history in the title one, but no, I didn't include it. Interesting.
Okay, I think it's now past. We should call it a day and go and have a drink and carry on conversations there. But we should thank Adam again.
And thank you for coming as well.
And before I turn off the stream, we should say that our next seminar, which I'm trying to find now, our next seminar is on the 14th of November. It's Emma Watkins from the University of Liverpool talking about the lives and criminal careers of juvenile offenders. And I'll turn the stream on.